I want to start, as we sometimes do, with a little quiz. And we have, of course, people streaming, so I might sort of characterize the results. And, of course, please feel free to enjoy this or just to sit and watch it. But how many of you think, it's a controversial issue, education, how many of you think our public educational system is broken? Thank you. How many think that until we come to terms to limit or eliminate the power of the teachers' unions, we can't improve the system? Okay, just a few there. How many think that vouchers, in which families get a certain grant from the state to use in any way they wish in education, how many think vouchers are a good idea? Okay. How many think charter schools are a good alternative to the system? That's a clear majority there. How many of you think, why can't we just go back to basics and teach literature and history and math? How many of you think that if we added a great deal more money into the system for teacher salaries and so on, there's no guarantee that that would make things any better? And how many of you think that teachers are underpaid and underappreciated in American life? All right, so we have a very large majority there. I love that. All right, so let's get right to it here. We so appreciate the quiz because it allows our presenters who come from long distances away to get a little sense of how people in the Valley see things. They also had the chance just a little while ago to talk to teachers and educators and administrators in the system. And that's really valuable, I think. So thank you for all of that. All right, so I want to start with our proposed menu, our roadmap. We'll try to get to all of this. We may not, but I'll try to keep us on track. Number one, I'll give a little bit of historical background, but not much. Number two, we'll talk about performance. How well are we doing domestically, internationally? Is there a crisis in American education for international competitiveness and national security? We'll address that for a time. Number three, the operation of schools, the funding, the management, the mandates, the greatly swollen portfolio of things that a public school must do compared to, say, when I went through public school in the late 60s and 70s. Then we'll talk about curriculum. What should we be teaching? One of the things that strikes me is that we're using a template that's over 100 years old in public education. So what is it that we want to teach young people who are going to become adults in mid-century? What do they need to know? Things are changing so very fast that it's hard to keep up. So what do we think we're doing for those 12 years? And how are we preparing people for the future that they're going to have? And are we doing it correctly? Then we'll look at school choice, which is, of course, a very volatile issue in the United States at the moment. And finally, and we will leave time for this, the challenge and opportunity of artificial intelligence. So there's a lot to do here. Let me just start with a little bit of historical background. So I'm a Jefferson scholar, and Jefferson is one of the founders of education in the United States. As you know, the third of his great achievements that he wanted to be listed for on his tombstone was the University of Virginia at Charlottesville, the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, and the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. Three extraordinary achievements, and UVA is almost always listed among the top 10 universities in the United States, and sometimes beyond that. But Jefferson believed that the University of Virginia was not for everybody. He believed that university education was for an elite of specially gifted or specially ambitious students, that we needed public education at the lower levels much more than we needed them at the upper levels. At the university you learn astronomy or metaphysics or advanced calculus, but he wanted all white Americans to have access to literacy and above all to citizenship training. Jefferson believed that the purpose of public schools was to train citizens, that his view was that we are born with rights, of course, but we're not born with the skill of self-government. And this has to be inculcated, and the way to do that is in the public school system. So civics training was essential to Jefferson's vision of education. During Jefferson's time, there was almost no public education in the United States. Towards the end of his life, he lamented that Virginia did not have a single public school. He died in 1826. He said that the public schools, such as they are in New England, especially Massachusetts. And he said Virginia is being left behind, and being left behind in such a way that it may be a permanent deficit. He said there are two things in New England that make New England the most vibrant part of the country. They have public schools and they have town meetings, which are exercises in self-government. He said, why can't we do this in Virginia? But there wasn't a single public school at the time of his death. In fact, the public school movement in the United States didn't really start till the 1820s and 30s. They were called common schools, but not everyone was permitted. Very few girls. No African Americans, either free or unfree, no Native Americans, but this was at least a beginning. It was not compulsory. Compulsory public school education began after the Civil War, and it was a long, difficult challenge, particularly because America was still a very agrarian place, and farmer families needed their children on the farm and were reluctant to yield them to the public school system. Then, in the 20th century, things really started to get a lot fuller. More people were educated. African Americans were educated. After the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau created schools for Black Americans, and this was a pioneering effort that later allowed the systems to blend together, beginning in, say, the 1950s and 60s. So that's just a slight touch of the history of it. The thing that's important for you to know is that our model didn't really come about until the beginning of the 20th century. And before that, if you were educated, you were fortunate to be educated. And in Jefferson's time, you were privately educated unless you happened to have the joy of living in Massachusetts. And you can see here this quotation from Jefferson, which I think about every single day, especially now. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. I don't want to be too opinionated here, but I'd like to say we are testing this proposition. Truly, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. The distinguished British historian Neil Ferguson, who's an expert on empire, has said that the Americans are the worst educated world empire in history. He said your only success is that you have a 3,000-mile moat on one side and a 9,000-mile moat on the other, and one of the great resource bases in the history of the world. But if you had to actually compete in the world the way, say, France does, or Germany, or Holland, he says we would be in very grave trouble because we are not educating ourselves for our global or even our national and domestic responsibilities. So that's Thomas Jefferson. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Really, the first great figure in American public education was Horace Mann, end of the 18th and through the mid-19th century. Most of his important work was before the 1840s. But he said this: education beyond all other devices of human origin is the great equalizer of the conditions of men. And that is a very key concept that I want the two of you to take a look at when we get our discussion going. The idea is that a school is a laboratory of democracy. Jew and Gentile, rich and poor, rural and urban, people from all walks, all religions, all social economic backgrounds mingle in the public classroom where they gain respect for each other, they learn tolerance, they gain insights that their own culture, their own family life might not have brought them. And it's in the interest of a self-governing democracy to mingle people from all walks of life to create the conditions under which there can be a thriving self-government. But also, it was Horace Mann's view that if you give everyone a chance to be educated, this will have an equalizing effect on the capacities of people. Some come less prepared, some more, but at the end of a public education, he hoped that this would create an equality of possibility, of capacity, for whatever came afterwards. And he said, common schools, by which he meant early public schools, are the greatest discovery ever made by man. Next is John Dewey, the most famous educator and educational theorist of the early 20th century, and he said, "Democracy has to be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife." And again, if that's true, I tremble for my country. And he said, education is not preparation for life. Education is life itself. Next. Finally, Derek Bach, still alive, president of Harvard for more than a quarter of a century. If you think education is expensive, try ignorance. And again, I think we're seeing some of the fruits of that in our time. Next slide. Just a couple of cartoons to get us started. Cell phones, as you know, are being sequestered in many schools, and so these children are having to face a clock. Do you remember what the big and little hands mean? And we don't teach cursive, and apparently we don't teach analog time any longer either. Next. I love this one. Student hands in an essay written by ChatGPT, and the beleaguered, cynical, weary teacher says, "By the way, ChatGPT's misspelled your name." And then finally this, diploma for a young man from Slapdash High School, certainly not here, and he says, "Read me what my diploma says, Dad." Partly because it's cursive, but also because, of course, he can barely read. So, all right, let's watch this clip from David Brooks. You may not have seen this. David Brooks gave a lecture in England in February 2025. We only have a little tiny section of it on education, but what he basically said was, we boomers were supposed to be the great thing that ever happened, and man, did we mess it up. Let's watch this.
We members of the educated elite did some good things. We created the internet, brunch, and mocktails. You're welcome. We did some bad things. We designed a meritocracy designed around the skills we ourselves possess, and rigged the game so we succeeded and everybody else failed. By age 12, American children of affluent kids are 4 grade levels above everybody else. By university age, rich kids are 77 times more likely to go to university or to Ivy League university than kids from poor schools. In adulthood, 54% of the people at elite workplaces went to the same 34 elite colleges. So we ended up creating a caste system. People with high school degrees die 9 years sooner than people with college degrees. People with high school degrees are 5 times more likely to have kids out of wedlock. People with high school degrees are 2.4 times more likely to say they have no friends. So we created a caste system, even though we pretend to be egalitarian.
All right, so with that beginning, a few statistics, a fairly dark attack on the age of Aquarius here, potted history of education so far. Give us some preliminary remarks, starting with you, Nat.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me. You know, my focus is generally data-driven education policy. I look at nationwide issues that I can highlight with data to raise them. I'm going to focus on what I've done after the pandemic, but just point out that before the pandemic, I typically used data gathered by other people. When the pandemic happened, I found myself wondering, what is going on in all the public school systems that are closed? And not knowing that, I started gathering data, and I've been doing that since. There's many reasons that I would point to COVID as a key juncture in where our education system is today. It was the greatest disruption in living memory, basically since the common schools came up. And it was a huge disruption, both on political aims or political considerations around schools, but also on how our students fared, and we've been tracking that. I think that a more important thing that I've been talking about recently is that the downturn in student achievement started well before COVID, and that COVID is actually and I think we'll look at this in a few minutes, is actually responsible for a relatively small share, or a surprisingly small share of the downturn in test scores that we've seen since around 2012. That should surprise you. It surprised me. We had the biggest interruption in public schools in memory, and it's a small portion, not as a majority share of the fall of test scores since 2012. And so I think that our assessment should not be on the short term in how our schools are faring and in how education is faring in the United States. I think that we've seen a shift that's been happening for about an academic generation. I think COVID was a huge demarcation, but it's not the root of the problems that we're facing now. And I think we need to take seriously those challenges and determine what we need to do differently. Because I think continuing with the same efforts, continuing with ideas, a little more funding, we should try harder, is not a recipe for success.
So Nat, I hear you saying that although COVID is an important inflection point for all this, it would be wrong-headed to make that the scapegoat for everything that's gone wrong.
That is absolutely what I'm saying. I think that the trends that we were on were exacerbated by COVID. Undoubtedly, I don't want to downplay COVID. I spent a lot of time collecting data on which districts were closed and for how long across the country. Believe me, with all that time investment, if I could attribute everything to COVID, I would. I tracked the data. I'd be happy to say that that was the most important thing, but it's not. There's a longer trend, and we would be foolish to be distracted by the shiny object and miss the general direction.
Jon Valant.
So I'm going to be a little distracted by the shiny object, because that's where I am. So first of all, thank you all. It's wonderful to be with you. I will say it breaks my heart a little bit to see education in the conversations on controversial issues section of the work you do. And that's not to say that education hasn't always been or shouldn't be controversial. It always has been. We've always had issues that we've debated and fought about, and that's healthy. But there is something very different about our politics right now in education, and I think a lot of it is rooted in COVID. And we've seen these really sharp disagreements that break on party lines very often, and that I don't think fundamentally need to be there. I mean, I have a hypothesis that if you were to go and ask parents of any political stripe what it is that they want for their kids and what do they want for their schools and what do they value in their own children, their answers aren't going to look all that different. And yet we're sort of stuck in this place where it feels like we have big problems right now. I mean, we have declining achievement. We have a lot of kids who are missing school. We have these challenges around technologies that are showing up in classrooms, and yet the problems we have are so detached from our politics and from the issues that it seems like we fight about. Like lots of our fights are about issues like which bathrooms transgender students can use. And that may be an important issue, and I think it is an important issue. It is not responsive to the actual problems of the day. So I think we are in a bad spot. That being said, if there's one place where I would maybe push back a little bit on the introduction, I think we also need to acknowledge that we ask a lot of schools. And schools inherit a whole lot of problems that are not native to schools and are not schools' fault. And then we sort of ask them to address those issues, and realistically, they can't. So schools can take us, a good way to where we want to be. They cannot solve social inequality completely. They cannot solve all of the issues that David Brooks is talking about. But they can do a lot more than they're doing. And where I certainly would agree with that introduction is that, for one, we have terrible levels of inequality in our education system. And that's not new. That certainly predates COVID. It has gotten worse of late, of these last few years, but it is very hard to be socially mobile and to do well without a strong education. And that is a reality, whether that is, again, the fault of schools or not, it is the truth. And the other part of the introduction that I liked very much is, I think in recent years, we've had this habit of focusing very narrowly on what schools do for our economy and how they prepare students for college and for career. But the truth is, we need schools in times when our democracy looks the way it does, and when we don't have a cohesive society. And schools, for better or worse, are the primary public institutions we have to prepare people for living that life and being contributing members in society. And our schools have really, I think, lost sight of that and have taken a very narrow view of what it is that schools do. And I think we, in some ways, where I think we tend to think that they can do more than they can do in a lot of ways, we also don't give them enough credit in they're not just machines for producing math gains and reading gains. And I say this as I'm about to show you some math gains and reading gains, but they're also the institutions we have for preparing people to really be contributing members of our society.
So I think I hear you saying that Horace Mann's view that schools are the great equalizer is a noble thought, but it doesn't really face the great complexities of our time.
I would say it's necessary but not sufficient. I mean, I very much agree with, I got into this space in part because I really believe that a wonderful aspect of American society, American political life, is that we do have public education systems that welcome all now. And they didn't welcome all from day one, but they welcome all now. And we cannot achieve what we're capable of without a system like that. At the same time, I think it would be naive to say that it's only schools. I mean, schools are operating. There's a whole lot of intersection between education policy and housing policy and tax policy and crime policy and transportation policy, and it's in that broader ecosystem. And I think schools can take us a lot farther down the path where we want to go, but they can't get us all the way there.
Yeah. So Nat, when you were talking about causes of the perceived or real decline, you mentioned 2012 and 2013, and it strikes me as coincidental that that's also when smartphones began to become ubiquitous in American life. And we'll talk a little bit about AI technology later, but do you think that that is one of the contributing factors?
So, absolutely, I do. And I've done quite a bit of work on trying to figure out why the data display the patterns that they do. So, first of all, there are some things that you can say from data. Data are wonderful. They're narrow, I get it. Reading and math scores are not why we do them. They're also extremely important. Reading and math scores can predict how many, your likelihood of having kids, likelihood of getting married, staying employed, your BMI later in life. I mean, these are powerful indicators. So they may not be the main thing that we should be. They are not the purpose of schools, but they are a clear reflection of them. Now, I lost my train of thought with the cell phones. Yes. So data are very important. However, once you get off of the data, there are things that the data do not tell you. They do not tell you why it was somewhere between 2012 and 2015 that test scores in 4th, 8th, and 12th grade at the same time started trending down. I think that the phones, and I would use gentle terms or maybe quotes around that, because I think there's also the algorithms and the internet having a deep and deepening effect on our lives are all an amalgam that I can't pull apart. So I do think that that's an important thing and an important component of this, but I would be very, very careful in overweighting the phones. Remember I said, well, COVID is very distracting. It's the distractive, shiny object, and it can distract you from what has been happening over a longer period. Phones can also be the thing that we can jump to and say, oh, it was the phones, stupid. But if it's not just the phones, if there's something more fundamental underlying this, I think that that is something that we should pay attention to. When we get to the test scores, I can show a little bit more about this, but one of the things that I would say about the phones and about this trend is that the apex of the test scores that we see happened at the same time for 12th graders and 8th graders and 4th graders. And I would submit that 4th graders didn't get phones to the same degree, not as many of them, or were allowed to use them as much in 2012 or 13 or 14 as 12th graders. So we might expect it to happen in 12th grade and then maybe a little later when it gets to 8th grade and then eventually when it gets to the 9-year-olds. But I don't think that all happened in 2012. So I think it's very important for us to not overweight that. because there's other things going on.
And so I think it's fair to say that it's not just the phones, but it's also not just the anything. There's no one explanation for the problems we have, and there's no one solution either. So I think one of the mistakes that we make sometimes in the education world is we go in hunt of that one silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems, and it's just not out there. And I think the same thing goes for explanations. But at the same time, I do think we have to acknowledge that childhood is very different now from what it was a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And if you have kids or you have grandkids and you're paying attention to how they're spending their time, a lot more of it is on a device. And it could be that it's video games, it could be that it's YouTube videos, it could be that it's social media, which does bring more than its share of problems into kids' lives. And this is one of those examples of where schools inherit this garbage. You know, like schools, I think, were too slow in a lot of ways to respond to the distractions that technologies bring. But at the same time, it wasn't schools that brought those technologies into our classrooms and into our kids' lives in the first place. And so it is one of the many ways in which I think what we ask of teachers is just, it's like it's building and building and building, and there's no way around that. But I do think that phones are a big deal. I do think that social media is a big deal, and I think it's hard to look at the patterns we've seen, and for those of us who have kids who just see the day-to-day of what their lives look like and what their interactions with friends look like, and not think, there's something different about this.
We're going to need to move on in a minute, but I just wanted to put on the table also that the loss of public respect for education is only one part of loss of public respect for almost everything. Loss of respect for Congress, loss of respect for the presidency, loss of respect for the media, loss of respect for the court systems, for policing, for the judiciary, for the Supreme Court, and so on. There's a worldwide populist revolution going on, and a reaction to experts, and a reaction to the way things have been organized for the past 50 or 60 years. There's a sense of deep, deep disillusionment. And I wonder what each one of you wants to say briefly about how that then would affect our respect for education. If there's a loss of general respect, including by parents all over the land, for this institution as for so many others, that means that there may not be the same encouragement in the household and elsewhere for the value of education. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that is certainly a challenge for schools. I think that one key distinction that I would draw here is this standard thing that you see in polling. We've seen it for, 40, 50 years when they ask the populace all across the nation, how are the nation's schools doing? They say, oh, not good, not good. And then all across the nation, how are your local schools doing? They're great. I love my local schools. So I think that to some degree, that with enough distance, we can throw a lot of tomatoes. And those that are closer to us, we take a little bit more of a discerning look at. That's something heartening. I look for everything I can say that's heartening, because there's some bad news on the horizon. So.
John, would you like to keep going?
Yeah, I mean, but at the same time, if you look at those trends, and Clay's absolutely right, across institutions, there's been this slow decline in what Americans think of all of our institutions. In higher education before K-12, it really suddenly fell off. And in K-12, right around the time of the pandemic, we saw this plummeting in what Americans think of public education systems. And timing-wise, that coincides, and coincide is not the right word because I think there's a relationship here, but with some policies that I think we're going to get a chance to talk to when we talk about school choice, that we've seen a lot of states in recent years, and very recently the federal government, make moves in the direction of universal private school choice programs that, to my eye, are designed to undermine our public education systems. And I don't think that happens if we don't see this change in public attitudes, and I think it happened right around COVID, in part because of schools' poor response to COVID.
Yeah, I wish we could go on with this. It's so important. I love this cartoon. I think you both see it. 1960, when Junior gets an F, the parents come down like a ton of bricks. I can recall this from my own childhood. But my parents never blamed the schools, never blamed the teachers. It had to be something absolutely outrageous for them ever to say, you know what, I think I'll go talk to the principal. They always assumed that it had to be me, and of course it always was. But now we live in a kind of transactional time where parents want to protect their child's mediocrity or failure of discipline by blaming the system, and it's so easy to blame the system, to make targets of the teachers or the curriculum or the school and so on. Surely you're seeing this too, right?
I would amend this because I don't think anyone has gotten an F in years. So we've seen, I mean, one of the many issues that our school systems have right now is they seem very unwilling to deliver any kind of hard message or bad news. And one of the ways that plays out is we've seen this terrible grade inflation that has gone on for years and years and years, and there is no indication that that is a reflection of our students doing better. They're doing worse, in fact, at the same time that their grades are getting better and better.
You told me a great story last night of your own son. Would you tell that to us?
That was Nat's
That was
son.
That was Matt. I'm so sorry.
And we should maybe check that.
So sorry, Nat. It was your anecdote.
Well, Clay, I'd feel more comfortable telling that story, but my wife is in the audience tonight. No,
talk later.
I was briefly just saying that and not to put too fine a point on it, but John raises a valid point. We don't give kids failing grades very often anymore, and we lie to families. We lie to families about how their students are doing. Now, I don't mean teachers are liars. That's not what I'm saying. I'm telling you that if schools are supposed to raise students to standards, teach them things, and if students are not learning those things and we are not giving them the feedback that they are not doing well and not effectively communicating to parents, we're effectively lying to them. And that's wrong. It's a huge problem. Part of the reason I know this is because my son gets some grades that I say, that is not A work. That is not B work. I don't know why they're giving you those grades. So I think those teachers in a very good school district in Maryland are lying to me. I think some of this is just an inability of schools, as John said, to tell hard truths. And I think in part of that is rooted in an idea that we should make school something that you get through as opposed to something that you achieve in. And I think we need to correct that.
So I know you're not saying that teachers are liars. You're saying that teachers lie to the parents and the family because the family expects to be lied to, and the system puts pressure on them to do social graduations and so on.
Well, to the degree that teachers are having more students not doing well, and there are lots of pressures how we measure students, both from parents' perspectives, but also from a district perspective, when we say, well, your graduation rate must keep going up. Well, our test scores are going down. Your graduation rate should continue to go up. In COVID, attendance plummeted. This used to be something that predicted graduation rates strongly. Absences went up, and so did graduation rates. We have, as a system, become accustomed to not giving hard lessons and hard feedback. And it's difficult, but it's essential.
I think on that real quick, I think and I should say, I don't put that on teachers. I think that's a state policy problem. I think that's a district policy problem. I will say one of the interesting little tidbits that came out on research during the pandemic was when parents were asked, how are U.S. schools doing right now? Overwhelmingly, they said that they're a mess. We're doing terribly. They heard about learning loss. They knew things were going poorly. And when they were asked, how are your kids doing? They said, oh, my kids are fine. You know, they're getting through this just fine. And that is inconsistent, right? Because if every kid is doing fine, then we would not see this collective slide that we saw. And that is our fault. You know, that is that we are not delivering the messages that we have to be delivering.
So Nat, we should probably put in a call to your son for rebuttal here, but we'll leave it for the moment. So we need to move on. How well are we doing? How do we measure this? Are we competitive domestically? Are we in decline? Is this a crisis? How well are we doing in international competitiveness on questions of national security and economics and so on? John, I know you have some statistics. I want to give you the chance to show us.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk very quickly about these just to give kind of a big picture. And I'm going to talk, so just to be clear, this is going to be a chart on math. We're going to talk very narrowly about a couple of these academic performance measures, and then Nat, I think, is going to talk about what is underlying this that I think is especially important, which is that all students don't move equally. And it's been the students who are at the lower end of the achievement distribution where we've really seen this decline. But basically what you're seeing in this chart, so this is running from 1990 to 2025, and this is performance on what we call the nation's report card in math. And that top line is 13-year-olds, the bottom line is 9-year-olds. I will say one good thing is that our 13-year-olds outperform our 9-year-olds. If that were not the case, that would be a problem. But if you kind of follow this trend, and it looks very similar across these two tests, we actually had a period where we were growing quite a bit. And I know this looks like it's a sort of slow increase here from 1990 up to about 2012, but that's not, in the historical context of schools, that's actually not a small increase. Those were big gains, and those gains came at a time when we also saw a shrinking of racial achievement gaps, racial test score gaps, and income-based test score gaps. Like, we saw some evidence that schools were actually getting better. One of the really interesting questions about this, especially when it comes to the early 2000s, is why, and to what extent was it, like, what do we think about No Child Left Behind? So No Child Left Behind, I think, is familiar, at least in name, to a lot of people. But it was the early 2000s federal policy that essentially enforced a structure on schooling, especially for grades 3 through 8, where states had to administer tests to see how kids were performing in 3rd grade to 8th grade in math and in reading and in some grades in science and in social studies. And there are a lot of really valid critiques of No Child Left Behind. It is also the case that when we had that kind of structured policy, we saw gains in student performance. Everyone got sick of No Child Left Behind, I think for some good reasons. And then you see this kind of flattening out. And as Nat said, like, this didn't just happen with COVID. It's not that we were doing wonderfully and then COVID came and all of a sudden we're not doing well. You see that plateau in these scores, and then a slow decline that begins right around 2012, and it begins before COVID. And in my view, that is a period where we sort of, as a country, we got sick of No Child Left Behind. I think there was a lot of, on both the right and the left, there were a lot of questions about whether the federal government was too involved in education. But we didn't replace it with anything. We just stopped doing what we had done before, and there wasn't really any unifying vision of what we should be doing. And then COVID hits here, and the bottom falls out. And you see it in math. I think we might have a reading. I'm not sure if we have reading. Where am I going here?
James will do it.
Oh, thank you. So you see it in reading. I'm not sure that we have reading here. Yeah, and actually, if you can go to the first PISA. So now, oh, thank you. So this is the reading trend chart, same thing, right? Same pattern that we saw in math. An incline, not quite as much, flattening, and then a dip. And you can go to the next slide. So now, where does this put us in international context? And the answer to that, so I'm going to show you 3 charts real quick. And these are comparing the US to other relatively wealthy countries, to other OECD countries. And the answer very much depends on which subject you're looking at. So this is math, and math doesn't look so hot. So we are scoring below average for our kind of peer countries when it comes to relatively wealthy countries. You can go to the next slide. Reading, we're doing a lot better. And then one more is science. And we're sort of somewhere in the middle. So my view of kind of where the US stands relative to countries around, wealthy countries around the world, is that it very much depends on what your expectations are. So I think some of us get the message, and we hear this frankly from our president. Our president often says that we have the worst education system in the world. That's not true. At the same time, we don't have the best, and we're certainly not getting the best outcomes of any country in the world. And I'd note too on the question of are we getting what we pay for? So another rhetorical point that you hear often is that we're spending the most money and we're getting the worst outcomes. That is also not true. If you look at where the US stands relative to a lot of these other countries and what we spend on education as a share of GDP, we generally spend a lot more on higher education than peer countries do. We spend about the same on K-12 education as peer countries, and we spend a lot less on early childhood education relative to other countries. And if it were up to me, we would close that early childhood gap. I think we would see it in our K-12 scores.
And you have one more.
Oh, if you want to see which countries are doing better than us. And so these are PISA tests. These are 15-year-olds. And you'll see it's a few Asian countries that have for a very long time scored higher than us. I will say, in defense of US schools, this is not a new phenomenon. So if we were showing you charts from decades ago. They would look pretty similar. If we were reading what people were saying about American schools, and there was a famous report in 1983 called A Nation at Risk, and A Nation at Risk pointed to these kinds of outcomes and said, hey, look how far we've fallen behind. I think it is worth noting that even at times when we've lagged on some of these indicators, we've always been a very economically strong country. And one theory for why that may be is that American schools have had some other strengths that some of these tests don't pick up quite as well, that they may be actually good at teaching some critical thinking skills and some collaboration skills and some things that don't show up in all of these tests and have not shown up in these tests for decades. That is more speculation than it is anything clear from data, but it is true that we are well behind some of our peer countries.
All right, and would you hand the clicker?
Yes.
Yeah, but before we go to Nat, so we see this, I mean, it's clear that we're not at the top of the charts, that we're not only below, but we're in decline. How alarmed should we be about this?
It's not good. It's not good. I would like to see us much higher in those charts. I'll say my biggest concern is not something that's immediately visible in those charts, but it's the reason why we're not much higher. And the reason why we're not much higher is that we have a really wide distribution in performance in this country, where our high scorers just score much, much higher than our low scorers, and we have these gaps in test scores and gaps in opportunity between what I would call our educational haves and have-nots, and it's wider here than it is in a lot of other countries. So when I see those charts, what worries me the most is what it is that's pulling those lines down, and I think it's that we're underserving the kids who need us the most.
We often try to cheer ourselves up, and maybe we should, that we do something much bolder than most nations. We have an extremely diverse and multicultural nation. A nation, for example, Denmark, would be much more homogeneous in its social structure. We have people from all over the world. Teachers say that they're in schools where there are 17 languages, and they don't have the staff to accommodate all of that. We have the issue of race continues to bedevil America in every zone, and including in education. Poverty, especially rural poverty, is a huge factor here. So we often say, well, we don't rank with the best, but considering what the challenge is of American education, we don't need to feel too bad.
So I think, I will say, if I could wave a magic wand and correct one aspect of American society that I think would have a big effect on these scores we're looking at, it's childhood poverty. And we can solve childhood poverty. There's nothing more maddening to me than the fact that as wealthy as we are, we have the rates of childhood poverty that we have, especially now that we know how to correct that kind of problem. That is not schools didn't create that problem. Schools can't solve that problem. And so I think it's fair to say that it's a lot to ask of schools to address all this stuff. And even if our schools were doing the best they possibly could, those gaps aren't going to close until we solve some of these other issues.
Of course, if only we had $200 billion to spend on this. But Nat, give us, you're a data man too, give us some stats.
Okay, so I'm gonna bore you for a minute and promise you that it'll be worth it, because I'm gonna throw a chart up here that you will hate, but I'm gonna teach you how to understand it. Okay, so what we're looking at here is just one set of test scores. This is reading scores on the same, well, it's slightly different, but a NAEP test. And we're looking at the different percentiles. So if you score in the 90th percentile, you're scoring higher than 90% of the other kids. So you're high, right? And the 10th percentile is low. What I want to show you here is that there are differences in how the test scores over time move by percentiles, but it's swamped on this chart by the difference between the 10th and the 90th. But I want to show you how they change relative to each other. So let me see if this is going to work for me. See that right there? That's the high point on this test. It's right at 2012, I think. And I'm going to scrunch this chart down. And then it's going to look like this. So this has changed since 2012, since the high point on this test. And what you see is the 90th percentile, it rose a little bit, fell a little bit, but is pretty much still in the same spot. And the 10th percentile fell by more than 30% of a standard deviation, which is more than a year of learning, over 12 years. The bottom 10 percentile learned a year less than they did 12 years ago. And this you can see in a bunch of tests. These are the averages, and the red lines are the 10th percentile, and the blue lines are the 90th percentile. Now, all the heights are, the top scores are in this shaded section, and this is a terrible chart. I have many people tell me, don't use this chart, but what I want you to see is that the lines cross on the left. But the 10th percentiles are all falling like rocks. And that's minus 60% of a standard deviation for some of these tests. For some of these kids, these groups of students are losing 2 years of learning over 12.
So
Okay?
Matt, the social implications of this are devastating.
They are terrible. What this means is the top scores and the bottom scores, not on 1 or 2 tests, on all these tests, are yawning considerably. Now, this, when I talked earlier about, well, is it the phones? There's lots of theories about this. One is the No Child Left Behind. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's the phones. Maybe we don't care as much. One of the questions is, well, is it the schools? And so if you thought this was frightening, I'm going to show you this one. Those are test scores for U.S. adults aged 16 to 65. I don't actually think this is the greatest data. It's the only data we have. I don't fully believe this, but if it is half this big, it should just absolutely make us fearful. And it should also make us scared to blame schools for what's going on. So let me just review the things that I think are important to understand when you're saying, what's going on in this achievement? Well, it started somewhere around 2012. It's happening to the kids on the bottom half of the distribution. I could show you other charts, but this is happening in America more so by a long shot than any other OECD country. And it may not just be the schools. I don't have answers for this, but I sound the alarm everywhere I can go, because this falling bottom, remember how Jon was saying, during No Child Left Behind, we had sort of a consensus. Something's wrong, we need to do something about it. Something is wrong, and we need to do something about it, and we need to be focused on the lowest achievers. The last thing I'll just want to say here is that the black-white achievement gap, the Hispanic-white achievement gap, the poor, non-poor achievement gap, these have historically been our main concerns, and this absolute achievement gap is growing substantially faster than any of those gaps. Race and poverty are not driving this. Something else is.
This is really pretty grim. So let's move on to managing the schools, by which we mean, how does the school actually operate? How's it funded? By whom? Under what circumstances? With what strings attached? Governance, mandates, and so on. I was just making a list this morning. You know, what goes on in a school. I went to a school in Florida a few years ago to give a talk, and the principal was in a poor area. The principal said, "Before you go, I want to show you something." And she took me into a room behind her office, and it was filled with hundreds of pairs of shoes. She said, "We have to do this. We have to make sure that they come well-fed, well-clothed, clean. We provide shoes for many. We're offering 3 meals a day to many of our students." She said, "You have no idea how many things we do that are not reading, writing, arithmetic, you know, the standard curriculum." So you have urban problems, just enormous urban problems in places like Chicago, Baltimore, and Detroit. Many schools engage in kind of a social welfare program. I've been to schools where on Friday afternoons students get backpacks of food to take home because food security is an issue at their homes. You have special needs students, and we've really done a lot with special needs students in the last couple of decades, but it's enormously expensive, and they come as mandates, and they're often not funded. Mandates, unfunded mandates, is a huge issue for our school system. As a laboratory of democracy, it gets more difficult as the number of mutually inexplicable languages continues, socialization, diversity, and so on. And then add sports and physical fitness and so on. If you try to add up, and I'm sure I'm making just an abbreviated list, if you add up the number of things that a school has to do, it's a swollen agenda that's not well understood by the public, often resented by the public, and certainly not funded, and the mandates often come without the funding that would make it minimally possible to achieve those. So with that, I mean, do you think that's a fair analysis?
I certainly think it's a fair analysis that we have a mission for school that is sprawling. And look, this is very difficult. We ask schools to do very many things, and we grade them on a very few narrow things. Those few things are sort of the central purpose of schools, and to some degree, I think it's unfair for us to narrowly expect them to do that and not give them the tools and the leeway, just the ability to act and to be flexible that we do. Look, we have 14,000 school districts, depending on how you count them across the nation. We have 50 states. We have a federal government. All of those are funded differently. The federal government funds schools about 10 cents on the dollar. That's from the feds. And they are able to get a lot of control for 10 cents on the dollar, a lot of influence. But they don't run any schools except for Defense Department schools, and that's just a rounding error. And we have a pretty good amendment. It's called the 10th Amendment, and it basically says, well, education's not in the Constitution, so it goes to the states. States have the authority, and they set down lots of standards and lots of strings that need to be dealt with, and they bear the responsibility, but they generally delegate these things to school districts. And school districts are pretty different. There's 14,000 of them. States are pretty different. I'll just offer another idea of another institution that may be just surprisingly able to make schools uniform, and that's advanced placement. You all know what advanced placement, these are AP tests, right? You take an AP test, and all kids across the nation take AP tests. And we can whine and complain about AP for lots of reasons, but here's the thing that's interesting. In America, there's one institution that standardizes across all 50 states. All 50 states have this brand, AP. Kids can get college credit. And so we have all these AP courses, and AP sort of shapes them, but the one thing it holds is the test. And that holds AP together. And so an AP course in one place is going to look a lot like an AP course in another place because there's an AP test that's defining these things. And we don't have that kind of uniformity across America's schools. That gives us a lot of flexibility. It also comes at the cost of coherence.
John, and in my list of the things that schools must attend to, I didn't mention security, lockdowns, gun violence, magnetometers, the sense that schools are places where this does happen and will happen, maybe not in my school, but somewhere. And so this is another big ticket item that no one could have expected.
No, it's unbelievable. I mean, I have a ninth grader, I have a sixth grader, and for years, they've talked about having drills where it's not a shooter drill until you get a little bit older. When you're younger, it's a wild animal drill. Or it's, what if something crazy happens? What part of the room do you have to run to and hide? And sometimes there's tape on the floor, so you know where the sight lines go and don't go. And it's extraordinary. The amount that we ask of schools, I think, it's too much. And at the same time, I think a lesson we should take from that is that these are really important institutions in this country, and the truth is, part of the reason that schools deliver food to families is they might be the best institutions that we have to do that. It's often schools that identify kids who have vision problems or hearing problems. Like, schools do a lot for us as a society, and it's too much, but I think it's all the more reason to appreciate the importance of those institutions.
And also, of course, to add to my list, there's the culture wars, which have very little to do with the actual fundamental business of schools, come through in waves and force schools to pay a lot of attention to something that is not their primary mission. And the partisan politicization of our time has had really a difficult challenge to all our schools, especially public schools.
Yeah, it certainly has. I mean, I think it's a tax on this public school system. The amount of time that public school boards, that public school administrators, to some degree to teachers. Certainly it's a headache for teachers that they have to spend on sort of culture war issues that I would say are just, you know, I get it that people care about these things and that they are important to them, but I would say it's not that important for the central purpose of schools. And I think that oftentimes what we have is loud people making a lot of noise about things that they feel very deeply, and a quiet majority that say we need to keep focused. If you're part of that majority, speak up.
So one of those loud people is our president, and so we were talking a second ago about Nat was talking about the federal role in education. I do think it's important to point this out. So one of the lines we've heard a lot over this last year or so is that we need to return education to the states. And that has been used as a justification for eliminating the US Department of Education and for changing a whole lot of what the federal government does. The federal government's role is and always has been very limited. And so in my view, the most important federal responsibilities are, one, they protect student civil rights. So it's the federal government that makes sure that states aren't keeping kids with disabilities from getting access to a fair education, or keeping students of color, or whoever it may be, or Jewish students, or Muslim students, or whoever it may be. It protects student civil rights. It administers programs that are by and large designed to get resources to the families that need them the most, to kids in poverty, to kids with disabilities. And it provides funds for really like research and data and understanding what it is that our schools are doing so we can see these kinds of patterns. And the federal government right now is not playing any of those roles well. And so we've seen a very different posture from our Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education, where it's not protecting student civil rights in the way it had before. We're seeing changes in how they're approaching funding and federal funds and where those funds flow. And we've seen the federal government pull funds from education research and from some of these assessments that let us learn something about what schools are doing. So I worry a great deal right now about the way our federal government is checking out, and I think it is rooted in what is essentially a mistruth that somewhere along the way the federal government started running schools across the country.
Department of Education, born in 1979, every Republican administration since has talked about limiting it or eliminating it, and now we're in a situation where this could happen. We want to make sure that we're talking about national trends, but this is a local community that's under strain, and particularly for funding. And you probably all know the statistic that Colorado ranks 50th in funding for education, and yet it's the 5th wealthiest state in the union. It seems, as a North Dakotan where we revel in that sort of thing, it seems appalling to me that this should be the case in the state of Colorado, which is such a marvelous, enlightened state. But we wanted some local input, and so we asked Phil Coleman, superintendent of the Eagle County School System, been there for 7 years, but a long and distinguished career in public education and administration. We asked him to talk a little bit about the funding problem here.
You know, the one mechanism that Colorado affords us to provide some sustainability, predictability in our budgeting is the ability for local school districts to ask their communities to support their schools. And presently, we are below what our neighbors support in terms of their mill levies or their property tax support for their schools. So I think we have the control locally to do better. And this November, we'll be asking the community what kind of schools they want. And if we can get this community to understand that we're in a competitive market and we have the power to fix it locally, I think this community will support it. So if we can pass this mill levy override in November, it's a game changer for this organization in order to be competitive. I don't have any faith at all that the state will fix this problem. Presently, I'm not confident that the federal government's going to do anything to help us either. So if there's hope, it rests in us locally to solve the problem.
Can we go to 61 now too? I'd like a teacher from here responding to the fact that to be a teacher in a place like this, a place of enormous wealth and privilege, but on a salary that is inadequate to living here, puts a strain on their daily lives and their professional commitments that makes it important for some of them to leave the profession because they just have to be able to make ends meet. So let's play this.
As much as I love it and I love showing up for every day for my students, it's really expensive to be here. I've really loved my time here and I love my school. So I'm sorry, I'm crying. But I love my school and I love my students. So when I told everyone at my school, I couldn't even stand up there. I was like, I said I'm moving and then I broke down in tears. It was a really hard choice, but it's unfortunately the choice I have to make, so.
I think teaching, especially in Eagle County, is...
So how many of you, just a quick poll, how many of you would be willing to pay somewhat more in taxes to bring our teaching staffs to the point where they have a living wage to live somewhat comfortably in this place? So for those who are online, it's almost 100%. That deficit is really alarming, isn't it? That, I mean, obviously this is a self-selected group. We're not talking about an average crowd from this zone, and yet there's a perception, and when you hear that someone has to leave the profession because they just aren't paid enough to do it anymore, for all the other strains that they're on, of discipline problems and violence and broken homes and everything else, to think that that becomes determinative is really depressing.
It is. I mean, from the superintendent's remarks, it sounds like this is an Eagle County, not a Colorado thing. I don't think Colorado has terrible spending, though I don't have the... I think they're somewhere near the lower middle of the pack, but I think that's a... I'm not gonna defend Colorado. The statement about the local levy is definitely an Eagle County issue. That's it seems to me. But certainly, if you have less funding, especially relative to your neighbors, you're going to have a hard time hiring staff, and staff makes schools run.
And when you live in a community where if teachers aren't teaching, they can get a good salary, it makes it much harder to compete. And I think just to be clear about this, there is no path to really good education systems without really good teachers. Like, if you cannot attract and retain and develop excellent teachers, there is essentially no hope. And we have issues with that in K-12. I would just point to we have terrible issues with that in early childhood. So as bad as some of these funding issues are in K-12, I would be very curious to hear what salaries look like for early childhood teachers. That is a major issue across the country right now. Time
is fleeting us. I'm so afraid. Let's go to what should schools be teaching, the problem of curriculum. And I come at it from the outside, but when I think of the number of social and technological changes in the last 15 years, and we're in an accelerate moment of this, it's hard to imagine what it is we should be teaching a young person who's going to graduate in 2050 or 2060. How do we negotiate this? The curriculum that I grew up with, it seems to me, is no longer very useful for the world that these young people are emerging into.
I don't know if I agree with that. So I think sometimes we outthink ourselves on this, and I think we're guilty of that right now. There's a lot of people who do the kind of work that we do are trying to guess about what students are going to need to know in a world that AI is going to change in some ways that are probably pretty fundamental, but in ways that we don't know at all right now. And this is not the first time that we've tried to make some bets around what is it that students should need to know. And I think in general, we're not very good at it. And the kind of things that students needed, I'm sure
in
you
my time. Thank you. Thank you.
In our time, the kind of things that students needed, I don't think are necessarily all that different from what students will need going forward. I think if you have critical thinking skills, if you can collaborate and get along well with other people, if you have some knowledge and some skills, like I think there's actually a risk that we try to get too cute here and to imagine a world that might not ever be, and to sort of lead students astray.
I agree with everything Jon said. I would push a little bit further, though. I think that, generations ago, I think it was fairly reliable that you could say, well, look, we have sort of a cultural inheritance here. There's some literacy, numeracy. There's some literature we should know. We understand sort of a corpus that we should hand down. Some of that was incomplete. I understand that completely. If you listen to sort of edu talk today, we get a lot of college and career ready, and no one's still been able to really explain what that means. But it sounds good. 21st century skills, even when it gets to things like critical thinking and so forth, sorry to pick on you, John, I think a lot of times these things can be, I'm not sure what that means. I think that schools really do need to focus on kids knowing things, kids learning sort of basic facts, how the government works, the basics of the trajectory of history, know how to read, but not just the skill of reading, know enough knowledge so that the things they're reading fit into a scaffolding so when they graduate high school, they know some stuff. The kids who know things and have a broader understanding are going to take better advantage of whatever AI helps them do than the kids who have a looser assortment of facts at their disposal.
Yeah, so, John, I'm going to quote St. Augustine, who's even older than I, who said that he would consider himself to be well-educated when he could read what he wanted to read, write what he wanted to write, and do the math on things he wanted to understand mathematically. That seems like a pretty good view of what we should do.
Who am I to amend that quote? But I would also, I think a part of a good education too is being able to go out in the world and to disagree well with people you disagree with and participate constructively in our democracy. I think it's more than what's in that quote, but that is necessary but not sufficient.
I would settle for it. We need to move on because we're going to run out of time. We'll go to school choice. This is a huge, of course, issue these days. We would have shown a clip, but a Christian conservative saying the schools indoctrinate our children. It's unacceptable. We pay tax dollars for this. They have no right to indoctrinate our children. That's why we're fleeing. We're fleeing because of secular humanism and the social justice agenda and environmentalism and wokeness and so on. I think those things tend to get exaggerated to a considerable degree, but there are people that are fleeing, and they're fleeing to private church schools, irrespective of their religious feelings, where I come from. They're fleeing to charter schools, which are really intriguing, and they're in some cases demanding vouchers so that they can go spend those, just as some administrations have suggested social security vouchers and health vouchers and so on, now school vouchers. Talk a little bit about what's happening with the sort of the flight from the public school and the implications for what's left behind when that flight occurs.
Sure. So this is an issue I feel very strongly about, and I think this is what we're going to look back at this time period and what we're going to notice the most. So before I say some very negative things about school choice, two things I do believe. One is I think parents should have some choice in which schools their kids attend. So my own kids go to magnet programs within our public school district. I think it can sound very elitist when families that have lots of choices tell other parents that they shouldn't have choices. So I do think that families should have some choice. Second of all, I have nothing against private schools. Like, I think there are lots of wonderful private schools across the country. I'm glad they're there, and I think they serve a really important purpose. That said, so one of the most important trends in our education system over these last few years is that we've had a bunch of states, and it's mostly red states, that have adopted what are essentially universal private school choice programs. So if you go back for years and years, we've had voucher programs, but they tend to be small and they tend to be targeted. So they might offer some money to attend private school for families in poverty or for students with disabilities or for some small group of kids. There is a very different generation of school choice reforms that we're seeing right now, which is they offer money to everyone. And the oldest program is in Arizona. It's only about 5 years old. But we've been tracking what happens with these programs, and very disproportionately, the money flows to wealthy families. And it flows to wealthy families in part because they might offer a voucher of maybe $7,000. It differs from state to state. It's not going to cover the full tuition at a lot of those schools that families actually want if they want to get access to those real opportunities. And we've seen, too, that schools jack up their tuition prices when those kinds of vouchers are offered. So it's regressive. It offers money to wealthy families, not poor families. It does not have the protections of our public schools. So one of the strengths of our public schools is that there are laws that ensure that students with disabilities are served, and that students of all faiths are served, and that LGBTQ kids are served. Those schools don't have to do that in a lot of states. And they also don't have to do that with a new federal program, a new federal tax credit scholarship program that's too confusing to talk through, but that my understanding is a big issue here in Colorado right now, because essentially what happened is, as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the Trump administration created what is not quite but close to a form of a universal school choice program, and now every state has to decide whether or not they want to opt into that program. And governors and their staffs across the country are trying to figure out what to do. More or less every Republican state has said, we're going to opt into this. We like private school vouchers. We want to be part of this. To my knowledge, the only Democratic governor who has expressed a lot of interest is right here in Colorado. So this is the only, I don't know if you would call this a blue state, but whatever you call it, the only state with a Democratic governor that looks very clearly like it's on the path to opting in is Colorado. I think a lot of other blue states around the country are very skeptical of this, or at least want to know if we opt into this program, which again opts us into what's essentially a private school voucher program, but also allows families to use money in public schools. Is there a way for us to opt into it on our terms so that we can avoid what are some of the to me, really concerning elements of this? And just to get to the last part of your question, why I worry about this a lot is, I think in a lot of these states that have adopted these programs, they're funneling money to wealthier families, and they're pushing our haves into private schools. And that is a recipe for a terribly segregated education system, where the haves end up in private schools and the have-nots end up in public schools. And we have not actually experimented with that here in the US. The country that came closest to it was Chile. And Chile did something that looked like this, and they experienced exactly that, where they saw a deterioration in the quality of their public education system, and then families that could fled public education for private schools. And I worry a lot about that being the path that we're on right now.
And I think I hear you saying that a voucher gives the illusion of choice and freedom, but that doesn't go very far in an alternative school. And so you think, oh, finally I get to control it. But if the school is going to cost $47,000 per year and you get $8,000 from the state, most families can't make up that difference. And so it may be more of a sort of PR victory as a way of saying the public schools are letting us down, but it doesn't actually solve the problem. You're saying it exacerbates the problem of regressive taxes.
Yes, and one very particular problem when it comes to these voucher programs, and one kind of an interesting political dynamic to this, is often the communities that benefit the least are rural communities, because they don't have a lot of private schools. So the state can offer money for families to attend private schools, but if there's no private school around, you're not going to attend a private school, you're not going to benefit from those funds. So there's actually been a lot of pushback among even rural Republicans across the country for this program. And I should say, there are lots of private schools that cost less than $40,000. So you can get access to some schools, but is that school any better than the school you're going to get otherwise? And what is all of this doing to our public education system? My view is, if we don't invest in our public education system, we are going to be in a world of trouble.
Nat, quickly.
So briefly, I agree with a lot of the things that Jon says. I particularly agree that if you want to do this from not a political, but a policy side, then what you want is a market for education, right? Where people can choose to go to the public school, or maybe they can pay some money to go to a private school. Well, to create a market for education, you're going to have to give more money to poor people than you are to rich people. A lot more, because school is expensive. I think that there's a very good justification for that. Where Jon and I part ways is that I think that competition is something that we must bring to schools. I think about places like Baltimore and Detroit. They've tried charters, they've tried many things, and they have failed children academic generation after academic generation. And the kids who are going to go there next year cannot wait. So I think that we do need school choice, and I think we need to do it better than we have been willing to do it so far. And I would also note that there's a bunch of folks who are against school choice and will not allow any local dollars to fund school choice, and then you're left with state funding, which is about 45% of the pie on average. So that's why we have a lot of vouchers that are worth $6,000. And $6,000 is not going to get you there if you're poor, so you should get a lot more than $6,000. And if you're making a lot of money, to my mind, you don't need $6,000.
Yeah, fair enough. I wish we could take that farther. We have to wrap up here. Well, the good news is we have exactly 4 minutes for artificial intelligence. So I'll stay out of the way. Have at it, gentlemen.
Oh, I think it's great. No, so I mean, AI in schools is the elephant in the room now for schools across the country. It happened very quickly and has been very difficult for schools to figure out what they want to do. I mean, I think I am of the view that this could go in a lot of different directions. A lot of it depends on how well we handle it on the policy and regulation side. I don't have a lot of faith in our policymakers and our regulators. I think we should be very conscious of the fact. Do you want to do this? We should be very conscious of the fact that school district leaders right now are being asked to make big decisions with very little information, and the information they're getting is coming from technology companies that are not primarily motivated by what's in our students' best interest. And we've been here before with tech companies, and I don't know of a lot of cases where it's gone well for schools. So I will say I'm on the cautious side. That being said, I do think there are places where it can help. It can help teachers, certainly. It can help certain students who might not be well served by schools. But my hope for where this goes is I would like to see schools double down in a world in which I think technology is going to take us to some kind of scary and weird places. I would like to see the 7 hours of the school day be an intensely human experience for every kid. I think we should. I mean, I was watching the news in my hotel room this morning, and Melania Trump was walking down a hall in the White House with a humanoid robot and saying that we should get these humanoid robots teaching kids. No, we shouldn't. let's have teachers, let's have humans teach kids. And that's not to say that everything that touches AI is evil and cannot touch our classrooms. There are ways that it can help us. But I would like to test those technologies and have some proof that it's going to help before we sort of give in ways that I think schools can do sometimes, and again, does not serve students well.
Yeah, I just want to wonder if that was a robot, but we'll let that go. So I want to use my own artificial intelligence to show you 2 quick cartoons. So this is ChatGPT. Here's one. Yeah, remember that when you had an overhead projector? Oh my, that was quite an era. But my teachers were like thrilled that they had that high tech, and they were really particular about it. They would put the slide up and then they'd pull a sheet over it so you couldn't see the next thing they just absolutely loved it. And then this one. So, when I teach now, I say to my students, the device in your pocket knows more than Thomas Jefferson believed existed. You have access to almost every book published before a certain time. There is an infinitude of information that you can get, so that the teacher of 1950 who told you the 6 causes of the Civil War is not nearly as important as she or he was then, because knowledge can rain on us. It's now, how do you evaluate knowledge? How do you work with these things? How do you develop critical thinking skills? It's going to be an interesting future. You get the last word on AI.
Yeah, so briefly on AI, I'm bullish on my own use of AI. I use it to a great advantage. I'm very wary of it in schools. So you may get the reference. I think it should be safe, legal, and rare in schools. I think that the reason that we need to value it is because in particular use cases, take foreign language, for instance. Now, you may say we don't need foreign languages anymore. If we're going to study foreign languages, having a student talk daily in Spanish with a fluent AI chatbot makes a boatload of sense, right? However, the danger part of AI is that it will replace the cognitive load that is key to students learning. And cognitive load is why we send them to school, quite simply. That is the central value proposition. And I think the argument that you will hear is, well, they're gonna go out into the workforce and we're gonna have to teach them how to use it. They are already using it to get around the work that you are giving them. They're gonna figure it out. You don't need to teach them that. I think that we need to make sure that school is still doing what is done. I don't think a moratorium makes sense, but I think we should be very afraid. And I'll just take one last thing, and that is we had a huge technological leap in COVID. Remember when we gave kids across the country Chromebooks? And then in a period of a year, but we haven't rolled this back in the past 5, most education goes through a screen now. I don't think we've evaluated that. I don't think we've done it carefully. The fact that my son's assignments are due at 11:59 p.m. the day before is just a testament that we have not proofed every idea about how technology intersects with education. So I'm worried, Clay.
I think implicit in that, and I know this from personal experience, is our kids doing homework at 11:58 p.m.
Yeah, that's exactly my point.
Oh, we haven't begun to cover this extraordinary issue of education in America in the public schools, but I feel certain the audience and the people at home will ask the right questions. I'll be James for a moment. Be brief, ask a real question with a question mark. Megan, do you have some for us, an initial question?
There's some processing.
All right, James.
Okay, so if you're online, please enter questions into the Q&A widget in your dashboard. If you're here in the room, raise your hand. Megan and I have mics. We'll do our best to get to everyone. Please do find a question mark. Stand if you're able. The microphone will be on when we bring it to you. Please speak into the microphone and not near the microphone or this end, both for the room and for the recording.
Woman right here in the front row.
And we'll start right here in the front row. But before we do, would you please join me in thanking our panel? Jon Valant, Matt Malkus.
They're great.
It could have been a 3-day program, but as we know, educators are very busy people.
And I want to meet Nat's son. I really want to have some conversations with him. He has a point of view here. 11:59, come on.
Thank you very much. 2 quick questions. Can you describe what the essential things are taught during early childhood education? It's been a long time since I was an early child. And Finland is widely recognized for its progressive, often described as experimental approach to education. Key features of the Finnish system: minimal standardized testing, late start to schooling, teacher-led assessment, short school days, and little homework. Do you have an opinion that that might be a direction we could experiment with for, essentially they're talking about formal academic instruction begins at age 7? Thank you.
Early childhood.
I can start on early childhood. So early childhood education over the years has become more academic in nature. So if you were to go back 20, 30 years ago, the thinking around early childhood was really for one, it was daycare. You know, it was like give a place for kids to go. And then also it was just let kids interact with kids. There is still certainly that element, and it is still certainly the case that early childhood serves a dual purpose of letting parents work and also developing kids. It has gotten more academic, so there's more emphasis on pre-literacy skills, for example. And I think one of the really interesting questions in the early childhood space right now is how much we should be pulling 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds into elementary schools. So we're seeing more school-based pre-Ks where, you know, those schools are, the teachers are part of teachers unions, and the kids are attending preschool, attending at least a 4-year-old pre-K in the same place where they will be in kindergarten, which I think, and there are different views of that, but can be a very good thing for ensuring that when a kid starts in kindergarten, they're in a good spot. And I'll say, we're doing some research now. So I do some research on Louisiana in partnership with some policymakers in Louisiana. And you can see, even if you have kindergarten reading outcomes and first grade reading outcomes, they correlate very strongly with college enrollment. I mean, look way down the line. And so getting kids in a place where they're ready for kindergarten and ready for first grade and what comes is really important. And so I'm of the view that it's healthy that we've injected some of that into the early childhood years, but at the same time, it's also a place for play and for getting to know how to work with other kids and hang out with other kids. So they serve a lot of purposes.
I'll just briefly say on Finland. Finland was the darling of international comparisons for a long time. And you're right about some of their trends, and they are not looking so hot lately. So their decline over the past 15 years is really, or maybe it's 10 years, has really taken sort of the shine off them. And I'm not saying anything against the Finns. I don't really know about Finnish education, but that's just one thing that I would say about the international comparisons. It's just incredibly difficult to do international comparisons. There are so many things that are different, not just the schools, although that is true, but who goes to them, the cultural background. And so while it's certainly clear that we should understand different forms of education, it's very difficult to port one style or thing into a different context and expect it to sort of work easily.
Over here.
Yeah, two questions, one for each of you. Nat, first, have you correlated the dollar values of school vouchers to your ugly spaghetti chart that was going across? How much school vouchers have been increasing over time?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, large voucher programs don't span that time span. And the other thing is, in most of these voucher programs, and I say that loosely because I don't actually have the percentage in my mind, but I would still say most, probably the majority, test scores aren't mandatory. And I think that's sort of silly. I think that, I don't think that every private school choice market needs to have test scores, but I think they would work better if we had them. And my opinion is, if we're going to spend states' dollars, it makes sense for states to say, your kids, they don't have to take a specific test, but they have to take a nationally normed reference test. So the short answer is, I should be able to answer that question someday, but the way it's running right now, I probably won't.
Okay.
Second question.
And then one for Jon. How do we bring that accountability and the ugly truth for schools to tell the parents what their kids are really doing? How do we do that?
It's a great question, and I would say, and this is where the question of sort of who's to blame and where do we go with it. I think fundamentally the grade inflation problem is an incentives problem. So teachers have every incentive to give good grades to students, and then you sort of run, like parents want to see A's, kids want to see A's with the least possible work, and it's very hard when you start thinking through the different incentives of the different groups that are involved in education to think of a way that you get to everyone working hard and you get to good information being disseminated. I think it has to be work that happens at the district level or at the state level. Some of the ideas that are on the table that people are experimenting with, so some is just information. So when I get my kid's report card, I see how my kid did. I don't see any context for that. So I don't know if all the kids in my kid's school are getting A's. I don't know if all the kids in their classroom are getting A's. And then on a stronger side, there are some proposals out there to actually enforce certain grade distributions, to say we're going to cap the number of A's that you can give. And there are some universities that are actually playing with that now, and I'm very curious to see where it goes. But I'm going to cheat, and I'm also going to answer your question for Nat, because I think it was a good one. And just to emphasize a point that Nat is making on these private school choice programs, and this is one of my big concerns about them. We have states, and now we have the federal government that are placing huge bets on these programs, and there is no attempt to build in any measures so that we can see if they're working. So we're 5 years from now, you could bring us back 10 years from now, and I think our honest answer would be, we don't know how they're working because there's no testing, there's no accountability, there's no transparency about how funds are being used. So that's one of my many critiques of these programs.
Here's a question. We'll get back there next. Oh, you sir.
Has there ever been any concept that school vouchers should be inversely proportional to annual income, so that wealthy families would receive no vouchers and poor families would receive very significant vouchers?
That is a fantastic idea. Actually, I have a paper that's coming out very soon that is an elaborate treatment of exactly, or a very similar idea. It's a little tricky to pull off, but give me your email and I'll send it. I'll send you a version. But honestly, I think that it's very complicated to talk about this mechanism. Vouchers are sort of simple. Let's give everybody
Freedom.
$8,000 or whatever the case may be. But really, the details matter here. And I think that's exactly what we need to do. So the short version of this is, as your income goes up, the state matches your spending by less. So if you're very poor, this is my idea, for every dollar, everybody pays a price. Poor people, they might get 19 bucks on the dollar from the state, but they still have an incentive to keep the price down. And if you're very wealthy, you might get nothing, or you may get 5 cents on the dollar, and it moves smoothly in between. Seems like that makes a market to me.
I was wondering if you have ever, I'm wondering if you've ever done a correlation with the size of the school with success rates and scores. I feel like there's a lot of thought on the humanitarian side, if the child is recognized, if they are seen, if they can really make the soccer team. And I know our valley is smaller, but we would often go to play a team in Denver, and the high school would have 4,000 kids. And you wondered, are they truly seen? Do they really know their names, what they're doing, how they're correlating? Because when we're talking about the humanitarian part of life, I feel like we go to school to connect with people. As human beings, that's where a lot of our growth is. Do I feel recognized? Do I feel confident? Am I going to speak up in class? Okay.
You got it. Good question. You got it. You have enough to go on there?
It's a great question. I agree very much. And I think some of the best schools in the country will talk about how intentional they are about making sure that every kid in that school has a relationship with an adult in that school, and they feel connected to an adult in the school. On the research side, there was an interesting experiment in New York City about a decade or two ago where they took some bigger schools and they just broke them up. So they took a school that had a few thousand kids, and they said, let's make you 3 schools, and you're going to have 3 different school leaders, and there are going to be fewer kids in these schools, but other than that, not much is going to change. And the initial research that came out on that said, well, it doesn't seem like they're doing any better, and so everyone kind of quit on the idea. Fortunately, some researchers followed up on it years later and went back to it and looked at that experiment of what happens when we break up schools, and they found that it actually was really beneficial to kids to break up those schools, and that's just in academic outcomes. And I think a lot of the outcomes that we might expect from that kind of thing are not necessarily going to show up in academic performance, but it is that students feel like people, and they feel like there's someone there who understands them, and they have someone they can go to, and someone cares about them, and I do think that is absolutely fundamental to what schools do.
And this raises the question of class size, too. Megan, do you have someone? Yeah.
Oh, quickly, I think one of the things that we really didn't look at is funding and paying educators a competitive wage, and how you think that plays out in our classrooms. The chart of nations that you showed us in Singapore, they're paying their teachers $100,000 plus 6-figure salaries, Finland, and so how does that play out in the United States?
I mean, I think that it's tough on the one hand. Look, I think that we need to raise teacher pay. I think that we also need to understand that there are, 3.2 million teachers? So a raise costs a boatload of money. So the real question is, all right, how are we going to afford these pay raises? And it's an expensive thing. And then the next thing, and you should expect to find this very unpopular. Most of the time, you're going to be spending more money for the current stock of teachers that you've already got. That's just, it's just the tough math. Are they going to leave? I mean, you may do better on retention, but the question is, what do you get for that expenditure, and what's the next best expenditure? So there's definitely been a rash over the past 6 or 7 years of strikes followed by large pay raises. So maybe that is what needs to happen. Again, I'm not saying I don't think that teacher raises make sense in some places. I don't think it is across the board. But man, it's expensive. And it's tough to get more money for education. And so the question shouldn't be, well, don't you like teachers? Yeah, I like teachers, okay? I like teachers, and I would love to have more money. But the real question that I would focus on is, what is the best use of the marginal dollar? That's the question that we have to answer. And if it's teachers, great, I'm all for it. But I think that's where we have to be focused.
I mean, I'll confess a bias here in that I'm an education person, and I would like to see teachers paid a lot more. I think it elevates the status of the teaching profession. I think it elevates the status of education and of schools. I think we would see benefits from that. I am also very open to the idea we should be paying teachers a lot more if they're serving in the highest needs schools. And that can be more controversial with some who think that all teachers should be paid equally. I am not of that view. I think teachers who are filling really hard to staff positions and going to the schools where we need teachers the most should make a lot more money than they're making right now. And then I mentioned this earlier, but just because I think it's a social issue that transcends education, early childhood teachers right now are making very literally poverty wages. I mean, they're in like they're below the 5th percentile in income right now. And my next dollar, I think, probably goes there before it goes to K-12, but I am of the view that we should be paying more than we're paying. I think we should be paying it in salary. So one of the issues we have is we do kind of goofy things with how we compensate teachers, and I would like to see teachers paid a lot more, and I think it should be in salary.
James.
I have 3 short questions. 3. Number 1, has there been a tremendous decline in the number of students applying to teacher education programs because of the lack of potential income? Number 2, are teachers being trained how to integrate AI into their classrooms, because it's inundated us over the last 2 years, like unbelievably? And number 3, I was a product of Montgomery County, Maryland schools, and 9th grade, everybody took civics. I think a lot of our representatives in the Senate and in the House would have profited by learning civics. Do most schools in the United States still teach civics?
Okay, can you review those real quick? What are because
disincentive.
Income potential for a teacher. So is there a dearth of people applying to education programs, teacher education programs? And number 3, are teachers being taught how to introduce AI into their classroom?
And then civics.
So I'll try, you grade my answers. So are they teaching them how to use AI? I'm sure they are. Honestly, I don't have a lot of faith in teacher training institutions. And also, there was a generational change in AI in December. I mean, it's just like totally different now. It really is. So AI's been around a lot. So I'm worried about that, but I'm sure they're doing something. Has there been a decline in teacher applicants to university? Yes. Is it because of income? Probably to some degree, but I don't know that for a fact. But has there been a decline? Yes, there's a general decline. And the third one was? Civics. Yes. I mean, there's civics. The curriculum kind of narrowed in the No Child Left Behind era to a degree. Now, I don't think that we stopped teaching civics generally. I think 22% of 8th graders were proficient in the last administration of civics, which sounds pretty not good. It is not good. That isn't, like, you shouldn't take that proficiency definition to the bank, but you should also expect more than 22% of them to be at that benchmark.
Very passing grades.
Thank you.
So a couple of notes to add to that. So I think one is on the teacher side. we have surveys of teachers and their satisfaction with the profession, and they have gone down. And being a teacher kind of sucks right now. So I think that is a part of it. And some of that is pay, but it's not all pay. It's also, I mean, teachers are telling us that like classroom management is much harder, and they feel like they're sort of caught in the politics. And if they take a wrong step, they could suddenly find themselves in trouble. So we have work to do on making the teaching profession more desirable than it is right now. And then I would also say on the AI front, so there's teaching teachers what to do about AI in the abstract, but like the reality is there are particular programs that schools are implementing, and I think what we need more of, and this isn't just about AI, this is actually about curriculum, like one of the kind of silly things that we haven't gotten right, although I think some states are doing better with this, is getting really good curriculum into schools and then training teachers in the actual curriculum that they teach. And there's an element of that to AI too, which is, it's not just a kind of abstract knowledge, I think there's a little bit of that, but it's also, let's make sure they understand the tools that are in front of them that they're using.
Can I just add one thing onto this? Because we didn't get to talk about curriculum that much. We allow or expect teachers to cobble together their curriculum. Most curricula do not last a full school year. The implication being, well, you should fill in some gaps here. And then there's also a tradition that, well, teachers are experts, so they should know what to do. And so teachers do report themselves that they get onto Google or Pinterest for ideas of what to do. Now, this is a problem because teachers should be professionals at teachers, and they are, but they are not all professional curriculum developers. And we need to separate those two jobs because we have the teachers we have, and we need to give them a manageable job. We talk about all the other things that we're allowing to sprawl on schools' missions, but for teachers, to not give them a coherent and clear curriculum that many other teachers we can also give to is a dereliction of duty.
That, I agree very much with that. And that is especially true in the K2 grade, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, which were never part of the sort of strategic think around No Child Left Behind. And that is, like, our curriculum in those grades is a disaster. If there's something that has been a sort of odd, but I think important piece of good news lately. So you may have seen reporting on the Southern Surge and the Mississippi Miracle, and the fact that it's some southern states right now that are not the usual suspects that are getting really good outcomes. It's Mississippi, it's Louisiana, it's Alabama. And I think that is coming in large part because they're taking curriculum much more seriously, especially when it comes to younger kids. And they're making sure that the content that kids are getting in those younger grades is evidence-based, and it's thought through, and it's not just whatever teachers are finding on Pinterest or wherever else.
We just have a couple of minutes left. Megan, you have something from someone online.
Yes, from our online audience. Do standardized tests or online-based student measures of academic progress tests adequately measure school and student performances? And if so, should other subjects like sciences or history be included in them to encourage their inclusion in curriculums?
I love standardized tests because it gives me measures by which I can understand the school system. And there's science exams of various types that students take. There's some reasons to think that an assessment of civics actually kind of makes sense. If we think it's a very important thing, right? What gets measured gets managed. So if you only take reading and math tests, you kind of gotta expect something that. Can I do a raise your hand? Raise your hand if you want to be on the committee for the civics curriculum. That's a tall task, I'll tell you what. You better be ready for a fight in most districts. There are dangers with too much standardized testing. I think that we can do it in a different way than we set it up in No Child Left Behind. And we're still mostly doing it the same way. So we could probably do it with a lower profile and in a way that could get usable information to teachers faster. So I think that maybe putting the cart before the horse is getting the test to be a little bit more effective and useful, and then maybe layering on other subjects.
Sure.
So I think it's a great question. I do think what gets measured gets done, and that is a challenge, because when we start putting tests in, everything that doesn't get tested, we just forget about, and we don't ask schools to do. And then I think where it can get even worse is we start to tell ourselves that the only things that schools can do are the things that we can measure. And so I do worry about what's lost when we go too heavy on testing and accountability. But at the same time, it is true that a kid's math and reading scores correlate with, from a very young age, correlate with a whole bunch of important outcomes much later in life, whether it's earnings or kind of a bunch of different adult outcomes. So I do think they're useful measures that we need to pay attention to, but there's a cost to it.
James.
Are teachers' unions a net positive or net negative to school
Teachers'
reform?
unions, net positive, net negative.
So I think like we should understand teachers' unions for what they are. They are advocacy organizations for teachers. They are primarily interested in ensuring that teachers are well served. Most of the time, in my view, what is good for teachers overlaps with what's good for students. And so often I think what they're advocating for are the kind of things that I would advocate for too, if I'm primarily interested in students. There are times when I don't think they do. And I think, I mean, in our politics, I think sometimes I would like, and I say this as someone who's coming from the left side of things, I would like to see the Democratic Party resist a little more with some of the ideas that teachers' unions have, because I think there are places where teachers' interests and students' interests aren't necessarily well aligned. But in my view, that is a minority situation out of kind of the whole of what I think unions are advocating for.
I would just say quickly, I come from the right side. I'm on your right. That's probably politically appropriate here between me and John.
I wore blue, too, for that reason.
And I got a sunburn. My face is red. So, look, I, on the one hand, have a much more skeptical view of teachers' unions just sort of by dint. But I will say that we complain that, oh, well, teachers' unions, they just extract rents from school districts and just all they care about is teacher pay. What have we been talking about teacher pay here? I mean, they haven't done as good a job as maybe they should have on teacher pay front. I will say this, that people, especially on the right, complain often about teachers' unions. They're the enemies. They come up with these terrible contracts and collective bargaining, and they abuse it. Well, school districts sign those collective bargaining agreements too, and we cannot let them off the hook. And they give away the store a lot of the time because they can't figure out another way to make a deal, and it is both unions and school districts that oftentimes sign contracts that do not serve children well. So you can't be upset at the unions and then not be upset at the districts that don't make sure that the agreements that are collectively bargained are a bargain for the kids.
I mean, I think part of where you get that negotiating room, though, is you pay teachers more. And if we paid teachers more, there would be more room for those kinds of conversations around what ends up in those collective bargaining agreements. But when pay is, in my view, lower than it should be, you see concessions on policies and places where maybe there shouldn't be.
So last question, we're out of time. 1983, A Nation at Risk, a public paper that suggested that there's an urgent problem in American education. If my math has held up, that's 43 years ago. It's a long time. So the question is, a nation at more risk, a nation at the same risk, a nation at less risk?
You know, it was a pretty good title, A Nation at Risk. I'm gonna go with this, A Nation Still at Risk.
Still at risk. Still at risk, but not greater risk.
You know, our schools weren't smoking hot in '83 either.
John?
So I think we're a nation at different risks. And one of my critiques going back to that time period is I think A Nation at Risk and what came after it paid a whole lot of attention to what's it going to take to prepare kids for a 21st century economy. And we started to focus very exclusively on how do we get everyone into college and make sure that they are making a lot of money and that our economy is thriving. And our economy has done pretty well, but it has done well for a long time. What I think schools missed, and what I think they are still missing, is that our democracy and our society has changed a whole lot over these last few decades. And there are a lot of skills, and I think Nat and I may disagree a little bit on this, but I'm enjoying getting the last word on it. There are a lot of skills and dispositions and ways of going about the world that I think we have to teach people. And it's everything from how to disagree with someone maybe you've never met and who's yelling at you on social media and who you only know as an ugly representation online through some words here and there. Or maybe it's that you can get duped by misinformation really easily or radicalized by, getting yourself set up in a place where you're only seeing words from people who disagree with you. My view is where schools, we really could ask a lot more, and I think schools have really let us down, is they did none of that work. So there was no attempt to prepare students for the very different way that our society is organized right now, and that I think is different from 1983.
I get the last word. A nation at much greater risk, but it's not the schools. Matt Malkus, Jon Valant, thank you so much. You really brought it.